The morning started like any other morning on Nova Crest. The sun came up slow and gold over the quiet colony town, and the streets filled with people going about their simple lives. Shops opened, children ran to school, and old men sat on benches drinking coffee and watching the sky. Nova Crest was a small human colony on the far edge of known space. It was not a big place, and it was not a famous place, but it was peaceful. And for the people who lived there, that was more than enough. Ethan Cole woke up in his small apartment on the third floor of a building near the edge of town. He was 34 years old, and he had a calm face and steady eyes. He was not the kind of man who liked trouble. He liked routine, he liked his morning coffee, he liked the walk to his office, and he liked the work he did. Ethan was a diplomat. He worked for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and his job was to talk to people, even when talking was hard, especially when talking was hard. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked out the window. The sky was clear and blue, and somewhere far beyond that blue there were hundreds of worlds he had never seen, worlds where strange beings lived and spoke languages no human had ever heard. Ethan had spent years learning about those worlds. He had read every report, studied every translation file, and sat through hundreds of meetings where people argued about what to do next. He knew the galaxy better than most humans did, and he knew one thing for certain. The galaxy was not always a peaceful place. He got dressed, drank his coffee, and walked to his office. The building was old and plain, with white walls and long hallways. His desk was near a window, and he spent most of his mornings reading messages that came in from other colonies and from Earth. That morning, one message stood out from all the rest. It was marked urgent, and it came from the highest level of the Diplomatic Corps. It said only one thing: report to the main conference hall by noon. Ethan read the message twice. Then he put down his coffee and went. The conference hall was a large room on the ground floor of the government building. When Ethan walked in, he saw that the room was already full. There were about 20 people sitting around a long table, and most of them looked serious. At the head of the table sat Director Mara Lindquist, a tall woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes. She ran the Diplomatic Corps on Nova Crest, and when she spoke, people listened. Beside her, standing very still, was someone who was not human. Ethan stopped at the door and looked. The being was tall, much taller than any person in the room. It had 4 arms, each one long and thin, and its skin was a dark shade of blue-gray. Its face was flat and wide, with 2 large eyes that caught the light in a strange way. It wore a long robe of deep red, and on its chest hung a symbol that Ethan had seen before in reports, a circle with 3 lines cutting through it. The symbol of the Kalethori. Ethan felt his heart beat a little faster, but he kept his face calm. He had trained for moments like this. He walked to a seat, sat down, and waited. Director Lindquist stood up and spoke clearly so that everyone could hear. She said that the being in the room was called Ambassador Theo, and he had come from the Kalethori Empire with a message for humanity, a message that no one had expected. Ambassador Theo did not speak right away. He stood very still for a long time, and when he finally opened his mouth, his voice was deep and slow, like stones rolling down a hill. He spoke in English, but his words came out careful and measured, as if each one cost him something. He said that the Kalethori and the Vidari had been at war for over 200 years. 200 years of fighting, of death, of worlds burning. Both sides were tired. Both sides had lost too much. And Emperor Zorath, the ruler of the Kalethori, wanted peace. But peace between the Kalethori and the Vidari could not come easy. There had to be a sign. A real sign that the Kalethori meant what they said. In Kalethori culture, the deepest sign of peace was adoption. When a Kalethori leader adopted someone from another species, someone from outside their own kind, it meant that the leader was willing to open his heart even to the unknown. It meant he was done fighting. It meant he was ready to let the world in. Emperor Zorath wanted to adopt a human. The room went silent. Ethan looked around and saw the same expression on every face: shock, confusion, and something close to fear. A human, chosen by one of the most powerful alien emperors in the galaxy to be his son. Not a servant. Not a tool. A son. Ambassador Theo looked around the room slowly. Then his eyes stopped on Ethan. Director Lindquist turned to the group and explained that this was not a small thing. The person who accepted this role would leave Nova Crest, leave Earth, and go live inside the Kalethori Empire. There would be danger. There would be loneliness. And there was no guarantee that anything would work. But if it did, if the Vidari saw this act and believed it, then a war that had killed billions could finally end. She asked if anyone was willing to volunteer. No one spoke. The silence in the room was heavy, like a stone sitting on a chest. Ethan looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He thought about Nova Crest, about his small apartment, about his coffee and his quiet mornings. He thought about all the worlds out there, burning and bleeding, and all the people dying in a war that no one remembered how to stop. He thought about what peace meant. Not the peace of this small town, but the kind of peace that could stretch across the stars. Ethan looked up at Ambassador Thale. The ambassador's large eyes were watching him. There was something in those eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but something like hope. Ethan took a breath. Then he spoke. He said he would do it. The room let out a breath that no one knew they had been holding. Director Linkfist nodded. Ambassador Thale stood a little straighter. And Ethan Cole, a quiet man from a quiet colony, felt the weight of the galaxy settle onto his shoulders. 3 days later, he stood at the edge of the landing pad on Nova Crest, a single bag in his hand. The sky above him was the same blue it had always been. The same sun, the same breeze, the same town he had lived in for years. But everything felt different now. Behind him, the Kalthori ship waited, long and dark and silent, like a shadow pulled from the stars. Ethan did not look back. He walked forward, stepped onto the ship, and let the doors close behind him. The journey to the Kalthori homeworld took 11 days. Ethan spent most of that time alone in a small room on the ship. The room was clean but cold, with gray walls and a narrow bed that was too short for him. There was no window, so he could not see the stars. He did not know where he was going, not really. He had read the reports, he had studied the maps, but reading about a place and living inside it were two very different things. Ambassador Thale visited him once during the journey. He came to the door, stood there for a long time without saying anything, and then told Ethan in his slow and careful English that he should rest, that what was coming would not be easy. Then he left. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and thought about those words for a long time. On the 11th day, the ship slowed down, and Ethan felt the pull of a new world beneath his feet. He was brought to a viewing room near the front of the ship, and for the first time he saw it, the Kalthori homeworld, Baeltor, and it was nothing like Earth. The planet was dark and heavy, covered in deep purple forests and wide rivers that looked almost black under the dim light of its two small suns. The cities were built tall and sharp, like teeth rising from the ground, and they glowed with a soft blue light that came from inside the buildings. It was beautiful in a strange way, the kind of beauty that made you feel small. The ship landed on a platform high above the capital city. When the doors opened, Ethan stepped out and felt the air hit his face. It was cool and dry, and it carried a smell he did not recognize, something like old wood and rain. He took a breath and held it for a moment. Then he let it go. A group of Kalthori soldiers stood in a neat line, waiting. They were tall like Thale, and they wore dark armor that covered most of their bodies. Their forearms were held close to their sides, and their eyes followed Ethan as he walked past them. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. Ethan kept his face calm and walked forward. He was led through long corridors of dark stone. The halls were wide and quiet, and the ceiling was so high above him that it disappeared into shadow. Lights floated in the air like small blue flames, and they moved when Ethan walked past, as if they were watching him. The whole place felt old. Old and heavy, like it had been standing for thousands of years. Then the doors opened, and Ethan walked into the throne room. It was the largest room he had ever seen. The ceiling was so far above that it was lost in darkness. The walls were covered in carvings, images of battles, of stars, of creatures he did not know. And at the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat Emperor Zorath. Zorath was different from the other Kalthori. He was older, and his skin had turned from blue-gray to a lighter shade, almost silver. His forearms were folded across his chest, and his eyes were dark and deep, like looking into still water at night. He wore a long black robe, and on his head sat a simple band of dark metal. He did not look like a man who needed to show off. He looked like a man who already knew exactly who he was. Beside Zorath, standing to his right, was a younger Kalthori. She was tall and lean, with sharp features and eyes that burned with a quiet fire. This was Lyrael, the Emperor's daughter. She looked at Ethan the way someone looks at a stain on a clean shirt, with something between anger and disgust. Ethan felt the look, but he did not let it shake him. He had dealt with harder stares than this. Zorath spoke first. His English was better than Thale's, smoother, more natural, as if he had spent years learning it. He told Ethan that he was welcome in this house, that from this day forward Ethan would be treated as a member of his family. He said the words clearly and without emotion, like a man reading a law. But there was something behind the words, something careful, as if Zorth was testing the air before stepping into it. Ethan bowed his head the way he had been told to do and said that he was honored. He meant it in his own quiet way. The days that followed were hard. Ethan was given a room in the royal wing of the palace. It was large and well-furnished, but it did not feel like home. The bed was too wide, the food was strange, and the language around him was nothing he could follow. Kalthori spoke in a language full of deep sounds and long pauses, and even with the translation device he wore around his neck, many words did not come through clearly. He felt like a man drowning in noise. The customs were even harder to learn than the language. In Kalthori culture, everything had a meaning. The way you stood, the way you held your arms, the way you looked at someone, all of it said something. And Ethan got it wrong, again and again. He bowed when he should have stood straight, spoke when he should have stayed silent. He touched things he was not supposed to touch. Each time he made a mistake, the servants around him would go very still, and their eyes would flicker with something that looked like pity. Lyrel made no effort to hide her feelings. She did not speak to Ethan directly for the first 2 weeks. When they were in the same room, she would look at him the way a cat looks at something it has already decided is not worth chasing. Once, during a meal, Ethan tried to make conversation with her. He said something simple, that the food was good, that he was trying to learn. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned away without a single word. Ethan put his fork down and said nothing for the rest of the meal. But not everything was cold. There were small moments, tiny, easy to miss, that told Ethan something else was happening beneath the surface. One evening, Zoreth came to Ethan's room without warning. He did not say much. He sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the dark sky for a while. Then he pointed to a star that burned brighter than the rest and told Ethan that it was called Solen, and that in old Kalthori poems it was a symbol of new beginnings. He said nothing else. He simply stood up and left. Ethan stayed by the window long after Zoreth was gone, looking at that star. Another time, when Ethan stumbled over a Kalthori word during a lesson with one of his tutors, a servant nearby, a young woman named Elra quietly repeated the word for him in a softer voice so that only he could hear. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Meanwhile, far from the palace, a human woman named Clara Voss sat in a small ship hidden in the orbit above Veiltor. She was a liaison officer for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and her job was simple: watch, listen, and report back to Earth. She had been monitoring Ethan since the day he arrived. Every conversation she could pick up, every movement she could track, she sent back. She did not interfere. She did not make contact. She simply watched and waited and hoped that the quiet man on the surface was doing okay. Clara did not know yet that things were about to get much harder. The news came on a cold night, when the 2 suns of Veiltor had set and the sky was full of unfamiliar stars. Ethan was in his room, reading through a stack of reports that had been left on his desk, when Ambassador Thale came to his door. Thale stood in the doorway, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, the ambassador looked worried. His large eyes moved slowly, and his 4 arms hung loose at his sides, which Ethan had learned was a sign of unease in Kalthori body language. Thale told him the news in plain words. The Vidari had received the signal. They knew about the adoption. They knew what it was supposed to mean, and they had rejected it completely. The Vidari did not believe the Kalthori were serious about peace. They said the adoption was a trick, a game, nothing more, and within the Kalthori court there were those who agreed with the Vidari. There were powerful people, soldiers, generals, advisors, who wanted the war to continue, who saw Ethan not as a son, but as a mistake, a weakness that could destroy everything the Kalthori had built. Thale looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he said one last thing before he left. He said that Ethan should be careful, that the peace he had come here to help build was now in danger, and so was he. Ethan stood alone in his room after Thale left. The star Solen burned outside his window, bright and steady in the dark sky. He looked at it for a long time, and he thought about what Zoreth had said. New beginnings. He was beginning to understand that new beginnings were never easy. The change in the palace happened fast. It was not like a storm that builds slowly. It was like a door that slams shut without warning. One day everything felt quiet, and the next day Ethan could feel the eyes on him everywhere he went. Not just the servants, not just the guards, but the high-ranking members of the court. They watched him the way wolves watch a deer that has wandered into the wrong part of the forest. The man behind it all was a Kalthori general named Dorikin. Dorikin was not like Zorath. Where Zorath was calm and still, Dorikin was loud and sharp. He was one of the tallest Kael'thori Ethan had ever seen, and his body was covered in old scars from battles that had taken place long before Ethan was born. His skin was darker than most, almost black, and his eyes had a hard, burning look that never softened. He had spent his entire life fighting the Vidari, and he did not want to stop. War was what he knew. War was what he was built for. And now, an outsider, a human of all things, had been brought into the royal family, and it was supposed to change everything. Dorikin did not accept that. Not for a single moment. The first sign came during a formal gathering in the Great Hall. These gatherings happened once a week, and all the important members of the court were expected to attend. Ethan sat near the back, the way he had been told to do. He wore the dark robes that had been given to him, and he kept his hands still in his lap. He was learning. Slowly, but he was learning. Dorikin walked into the hall with a group of soldiers behind him. He did not look at Zorath right away. He walked straight to the center of the room, stopped, and turned to face the crowd. Then his eyes found Ethan. He did not say anything at first. He just stared. It was the kind of stare that was meant to make someone feel small. Ethan held the look. He did not look away, and he did not blink. After a long moment, Dorikin turned away and took his seat. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had seen it. Everyone understood what it meant. After that night, things got worse for Ethan. The servants who had been kind to him, the ones who had helped him learn words, who had quietly guided him through the customs, they began to pull back. They still did their jobs, but they spoke less, smiled less, and avoided being near him when others were watching. Ethan understood why. They were afraid. Dorikin's influence was growing, and anyone who was seen being friendly to Ethan was putting themselves at risk. The court members began to mock him, though not always with words. Sometimes it was a look, a whisper, or a sudden silence when Ethan walked into a room. Once, during a meal, someone placed a dish in front of him that was known among the Kael'thori to be a symbol of rejection. A plate of raw grain, the kind of food that was given to animals. Ethan looked at the plate for a moment. Then he picked up his utensil, ate the grain without complaint, and finished his meal. He did not show any emotion on his face. Inside, his stomach turned, but he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Lyrel watched all of this from a distance. She saw how her father's name was being whispered in dark corners. She saw how Dorikin was gathering support among the War Council, the group of generals and advisors who helped the Emperor make decisions about war and peace. And she saw how Ethan, this quiet human man, was becoming the center of everything. Because of him, her father looked weak. Because of him, the Kael'thori Empire was being laughed at by the Vidari. At least, that was what people were saying. She began to resent Ethan more than ever before. One evening, Lyrel found him alone in the garden, a strange, dark place behind the palace where plants with silver leaves grew under the light of the 2 moons. Ethan was sitting on a stone looking at the sky. He did not hear her come. She stopped a few steps away and watched him for a while. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from not sleeping, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. Lyrel almost said something. Almost. But then she remembered the grain on his plate, and the looks on the faces of the court, and the way her father had to defend his decision again and again. She turned and walked away without a word. But something stayed with her. Something she could not quite shake. Ethan, meanwhile, was not doing nothing. He had spent weeks watching the court, watching the people, watching the way power moved in this palace. He was a diplomat. That was his training. And diplomats do not fight with fists or weapons. They fight with understanding. They fight with patience. And Ethan had both. He began to pay close attention to the members of the War Council. Not Dorikin. Dorikin was lost. Ethan knew that. The general's mind was set, and no amount of talking would change it. But there were others on the council. Older members, quieter ones, who had seen enough war to know what it cost. These were the people Ethan focused on. He did not approach them directly. That would have been too obvious, and it would have put them in danger. Instead, he found small ways to be near them. He attended the same ceremonies they attended. He sat in the same halls. And, when the moment was right, when no one important was watching, he would speak. Just a word or two. A simple observation about the weather, about the history of the palace, about something he had learned from his lessons. Nothing political. Nothing that could be used against him or against them. But over time, those small moments added up. The older council members began to notice that Ethan was not what Dorikin said he was. He was not weak. He was not a fool. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, He spoke with a calm and honest voice that was hard to ignore. Clara Voss, watching from her ship in orbit, picked up fragments of these conversations through her monitoring equipment. She sent her reports back to Earth, and the people reading them began to pay attention. Something was happening on Veiltor. Something slow and quiet, but something real. The moment everything changed came on a night when the sky was heavy with clouds, and the palace was dark and still. Dorikin called a meeting of the War Council. He did not invite Zorath. He did not need to. He had enough support to move forward without the Emperor's blessing. He stood before the council and spoke with fire in his voice. He said that the adoption of the human was an insult to the Kael'thori people. He said it was a sign of weakness that the Vidari would never respect. He said that peace through an outsider was a dream, nothing more. And he said that he had a way to fix it. He proposed a formal trial. In Kael'thori law, any member of the court could challenge a decision made by the Emperor, but only through a trial held before the full court. It was rare. It had not happened in over 100 years. But the law was clear, and Dorikin knew it well. The trial would be public. It would be heard by every member of the court, every general, every advisor. And in the trial, Ethan would have to defend himself. Not just his place in the family, but the very idea that peace was possible. If Ethan lost, the adoption would be undone. Zorath's decision would be erased, and the war would go on. The council voted. It was close, closer than Dorikin had expected. But it passed. The trial was set. When the news reached Ethan, he was in his room, sitting by the window, looking at the star Solène. Ambassador Thale brought him the news himself. He stood in the doorway, his arms hanging loose, his voice quiet. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Thale finished, Ethan nodded once. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He looked the way a man looks when he has been expecting something for a long time, and it has finally arrived. He thanked Thale. Then he turned back to the window and watched the star burn bright and steady in the dark sky above Veiltor. The trial was coming, and Ethan Cole was ready. The day of the trial arrived, like the sun arriving after a long and dark winter. Everyone on Veiltor knew about it. The news had spread through the palace, through the city, and across the empire. Broadcasts carried the story to every corner of Kael'thori space. And beyond that, in the cold silence between stars, the Vidari were listening too. They had their own channels, their own spies, their own ways of hearing what happened inside the Kael'thori Empire. And this was something they did not want to miss. The trial was held in the Grand Chamber, a room so large that it could hold thousands. The walls were made of dark stone, and they were carved with the history of the Kael'thori people. Wars fought, worlds conquered, and emperors who had risen and fallen over thousands of years. The ceiling was open to the sky, and the light of the two suns came down in long golden beams that cut through the shadows like blades. In the center of the room there was a raised platform where the one being judged had to stand, and around that platform, in rows that stretched back and back until they disappeared into the dim light, sat the members of the court. Ethan walked into the room and felt the silence hit him like a wall. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. He wore simple dark robes, the same ones he had worn since the day he arrived on Veiltor. He did not wear anything bright, nothing that showed off, nothing that said he was trying to be more than what he was. He was a human man, that was all. And he would stand before this court as exactly that. He walked to the center platform and stepped up onto it. His legs felt steady beneath him. His hands were calm at his sides. He looked out at the sea of faces, the dark eyes of the Kael'thori watching him from every direction, and he did not flinch. Dorikin stood at the front of the chamber, on the left side. He was dressed in his full military armor, polished and sharp, and his scars were visible on his arms and neck. He looked like a man who had earned every one of those marks, and he wore them proudly. His eyes locked onto Ethan the moment he entered the room, and they did not move. On the right side, standing alone on a raised seat, was Emperor Zorath. He sat very still, his silver skin catching the light of the suns. His face showed nothing. He did not smile, did not frown, did not look worried. He simply watched. But Ethan had spent enough time near Zorath to know that behind those calm eyes, the Emperor was thinking very hard. And beside Zorath, in the seat next to him, sat Lireo. Ethan noticed her right away. She was not looking at him with the cold anger he had seen before. Her face was different now, tight, unsure, as if she was watching something she did not fully understand. She sat with her arms folded across her chest, and her eyes moved slowly between Ethan and her father as if she was trying to figure out which one of them she believed.
The trial began. Dorikin spoke first.
He walked to the center of the chamber not far from where Ethan stood and turned to face the court. His voice was loud and strong, and it filled the room like thunder filling a valley. He spoke in the old, formal language of Caelthori law, and a translator repeated his words in softer tones for those who needed them. He made his case with fire and conviction. He said that the Emperor had made a mistake, that bringing a human into the royal family was not a sign of peace, it was a sign of weakness. He said that the Vidari had already shown what they thought of this act. They had laughed at it. They had rejected it. And now the Caelthori Empire, one of the oldest and most powerful empires in the galaxy, was being made to look like a fool on the stage of the universe. He said that Ethan Cole was not a son. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the path Zorath had chosen. And he asked the court to end the adoption, to restore the honor of the empire, and to go back to the only thing that had ever worked against the Vidari: strength. When Dorican finished, the room was quiet. Many of the court members nodded. Some looked at each other with knowing eyes. Dorican had said what a large part of them was already feeling. It was a powerful speech, and everyone in the room knew it. Then it was Ethan's turn. He did not move right away. He stood on the platform for a long moment, looking out at the faces before him. He was not trying to think of what to say. He already knew. He had known for weeks. He had thought about this moment every single night since the trial was announced, sitting by his window watching the star Selene burn in the dark sky. He had turned his words over and over in his mind, not to make them sound impressive, but to make them true. He began to speak. His voice was not loud like Dorican's. It was calm and quiet, and it carried across the chamber not because of its strength, but because of its steadiness. He spoke in English first, and the translator carried his words into Caelthori. But the way he spoke, the tone, the honesty, the weight behind every word, it did not need translation. He told them about Earth, about a world that had seen war up close, again and again, for centuries. He told them about the wars humans had fought among themselves, wars that had burned cities, broken families, and left scars on the land that took generations to heal. He did not speak about it with shame. He spoke about it with honesty. He said that humans knew what war did to a people. They had lived it. They had felt it in their bones. Then he told them why he had come to Vaeltor. He said it was not because he was brave. He said it was not because he wanted glory or fame or a place in history. He said he had come because someone had to, because peace did not happen by itself. Peace was not something that fell from the sky like rain. Peace was something that had to be built, one step at a time, by people who were willing to be uncomfortable, willing to be afraid, and willing to try anyway. He said that he had been afraid every single day since he arrived on this world. Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of not understanding. Afraid of being alone in a place where nothing was familiar. But he had stayed. Not because he had no choice. He had a choice. He could have given up. He could have asked to go home. But he stayed because he believed that what Zorath had done, this act of adoption, this reaching out across the divide between two species, was the most important thing anyone had done in this war in 200 years. He looked at the court members one by one. He looked at the older ones, the ones who had seen enough death to know its price. He looked at the younger ones, the ones who had grown up hearing stories of war but had never seen what it truly cost, and he spoke to all of them. He said that strength was not only about fighting. He said that it took more strength to put down a weapon than to pick one up, that it took more courage to say I am willing to change than to say I will never stop. And he said that the Caelthori, a people who had survived for thousands of years, who had built an empire that stretched across the stars, were strong enough to do something no one expected them to do. They were strong enough to choose peace. When he finished speaking, the room was silent. No one moved. No one whispered. The two suns hung high above, and their light poured down into the chamber like something holy. Ethan stood on the platform, his hands at his sides, his face calm and open. He had said everything he needed to say. Now it was up to them. Dorican's face was hard and tight. He did not look at Ethan. He looked at the court, trying to read the faces, trying to find the anger he expected to see. But something had shifted. The nods that had come so easily after his own speech were not there now. The eyes that had agreed with him were now looking somewhere else, looking inward, thinking. The vote was called. It was close, closer than anyone had expected. The court was divided, torn between the old way and the new. But when the final count was done, the result was clear. Dorican had lost. The adoption would stand. Ethan would remain a son of the Caelthori Emperor. Dorican stood very still for a long time after the result was announced. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber without a word. His soldiers followed him in silence. Ethan stepped down from the platform, His legs felt heavy now, as if all the weight he had been carrying for months had finally settled into his bones. He walked slowly towards Zorath, and the Emperor stood up from his seat and came down to meet him. They stood face to face for a moment. Zorath did not speak. He did not need to. He simply looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and in those deep, dark eyes, Ethan saw something he had not seen before. Trust. Real, quiet, honest trust. Zorath nodded once, a small nod, slow and deliberate, and Ethan nodded back. It was a small thing. But in that moment, standing in the golden light of the Grand Chamber with the weight of 200 years of war hanging in the air around them, it felt like everything. Lirael watched from her seat. She did not say anything. She did not move. But her arms, which had been folded tight across her chest for the entire trial, slowly came apart. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived on Vaeltor, something in her eyes looked less like anger and more like understanding. The message arrived 3 days after the trial. It came not through the usual channels, not through the ambassadors or the spies or the long lines of communication that had carried words between the Kael'thori and the Vaedari for 2 centuries. It came through a channel that had not been used in over 50 years, an old, forgotten frequency that both empires had once shared, back when they still believed they could talk to each other. Ambassador Thale was the one who found it. He came to Ethan's room early in the morning, before the suns had fully risen, and his voice carried something Ethan had never heard in it before. Something close to excitement. He told Ethan that the Vaedari wanted to talk, not through spies, not through threats. They wanted to sit down, face to face, and talk about ending the war. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after Thale left. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat there and let the weight of what he had just heard settle into his mind. The trial had been broadcast across Kael'thori space, and the Vaedari had been listening. Every word Ethan had spoken in that chamber had traveled through the silence of space and reached the ears of people he had never met, on a world he had never seen. And something in those words, something quiet and honest and real, had touched them. The war that had burned for 200 years was not over yet, but for the first time, it looked like it might end. Clara Voss heard the news from her ship in orbit above Vaeltor. She had been monitoring every signal, every conversation she could pick up, since the day Ethan had arrived. And now she sat in her small cabin, reading the report on her screen, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. She sent an urgent message back to Earth, and within hours the United Earth Diplomatic Corps was on alert. They began to prepare a small team, advisors, translators, people who understood how peace was built between species that had spent generations trying to destroy each other. Clara was asked to lead the team on the ground. She accepted without hesitation. The Peace Summit was set to take place on a neutral world, a small, quiet planet called Mireth, located exactly between Kael'thori and Vaedari space. It was a world with no history of war, no great cities, no powerful leaders, just wide-open fields, calm rivers, and a sky full of stars. It was chosen for exactly that reason. I would be so happy neither side would feel that the other had an advantage. The ground was even. The air was clean, and the silence of the place made it feel like the right place to begin something new. Preparations took 2 weeks. During that time, the palace on Vaeltor was busy. Zorath spent long hours with his advisors, going over every detail of what would be said and how it would be said. Thale worked closely with Clara and her Earth team, sharing information, answering questions, and making sure that both sides understood what the other needed to hear. Ethan spent most of his time alone, walking through the palace gardens, thinking. The silver-leaved plants swayed in the cool air, and the moons hung low and bright above him. He thought about the words he had spoken in the Grand Chamber. He thought about the faces of the court members when he had finished. And he thought about what was coming next, a room full of Vaedari, beings he had never met, beings who had spent their entire lives fighting the Kael'thori. He would have to speak to them too, and this time the stakes were even higher. One evening, before the journey to Mireth began, Lirael came to find him. She found him in the garden, sitting on the same stone where she had once watched him from a distance, and walked away without a word. He was looking at the sky, the way he often did. She stood a few steps behind him, the same way she had stood that night before, but this time she did not turn and leave. She sat down beside him. Not close. There was space between them, but beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The night was quiet, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the silver leaves in the wind. Then Lirael spoke. Her English was careful and slow, but it was clear. She said that she had watched him during the trial. She said that she had listened to every word he said. And she said that she had been wrong about him. Ethan looked at her. She was not looking back at him. She was looking at the sky, her jaw tight, as if the words were costing her something to say. He understood. For a Kelthori, especially one as proud as Lirael, admitting that she had been wrong was not a small thing. It was one of the hardest things a person could do. He did not make it harder for her. He simply nodded and said that it was okay, that he understood. They sat together for a while longer watching the stars, and when Lirael finally stood up to leave, she paused for a moment and looked at him. Then she said something that surprised him. She said that when they went to Mirith, she wanted to stand beside him. Not behind him, beside him. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile, and said he would like that. The journey to Mirith took 4 days. Ethan traveled on a Kelthori ship, along with Zorath, Lirael, Thale, and a small group of advisors. Clara and her Earth team traveled on a separate ship and arrived at Mireth a day before the others. When Ethan stepped off the ship and felt the ground of Mireth beneath his feet, he took a deep breath. The air was warm and sweet, and the sky above was a soft shade of gold, the way it looked just before sunset. It was a gentle world, a calm world, and Ethan felt, for the first time in months, that the air around him was not heavy with tension. The Vidari arrived the next morning. Ethan saw them from across the wide field where the summit was being held. They were different from the Kelthori, smaller, leaner, with skin that shifted color depending on the light, moving from green to silver to pale gold. They had 2 arms, like humans, but their hands had more fingers, and they moved with a grace that made them look almost like water flowing. They wore robes of white and pale blue, and they walked in silence, their eyes scanning the field, taking in everything around them. The 2 groups stood on opposite sides of the field for a long moment, looking at each other. 200 years of war hung in the air between them, invisible but heavy, like a wall that had no stones but could not be walked through. Then Ethan stepped forward. He walked into the space between the 2 groups, the empty ground that no one had dared to cross. He walked slowly, and he walked alone. Clara watched from the side, her hands tight at her sides, her heart beating fast. Zorath watched from behind, his face calm and still. Lirael stood beside her father, and her eyes followed Ethan every step of the way. Ethan stopped in the middle of the field. He turned, first to the Kelthori, then to the Vidari, and then he spoke. Did not give a long speech this time. He did not tell stories or make arguments. He simply said what was true. He said that he was a human man from a small colony far away, and that he had no power, no army, and no great title. He said that he had come to this place because 2 great peoples had been hurting each other for a very long time, and he truly believed, that they were both tired of it. He said that peace was not something he could give them. No one could give it to them. But he could stand here, in this space between them, and show them that it was possible to take the first step. He looked at the Vidari leaders, he looked at the Kelthori advisors, and he said that he was ready to help, if they were willing to try. The silence that followed was long. The wind moved across the field, carrying the sweet smell of Myreth with it. The golden sky stretched above them, wide and endless. Then, the leader of the Vidari, an older being with skin the color of pale silver, stepped forward. He walked slowly, the way Ethan had walked, into the space between the 2 groups. He stopped a few steps from Ethan and looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, a single slow nod, and the negotiations began. It lasted 10 days, 10 days of talking, of listening, of finding the words that both sides could accept. Clara and her Earth team worked alongside Ethan every step of the way, helping translate not just the languages but the feelings, the fear, the pride, the hope that each side carried with them. Zorath sat through every session, calm and patient, never pushing, never demanding, and Lirael stood beside Ethan the way she had promised, through every difficult moment. There were hard days, days when the talks almost fell apart, when old wounds reopened and voices grew loud and angry. On those days, Ethan did not try to fix everything at once. He simply listened. He let the anger pass through the room like a storm passing over a field. And when the storm was done, he spoke again, quietly, honestly, with patience that never ran out. On the 10th day, the final agreement was reached. It was not a perfect peace. It was not the end of all problems between the 2 empires. But it was a beginning, a real, solid, honest beginning. The war that had burned for 200 years was over. No more fighting. No more worlds burning. No more children growing up knowing nothing but conflict. The ceremony was held at sunset on the field where Ethan had first stepped into the space between the two groups. Both sides stood together, not across from each other, but side by side. Zorath and the Vidari leaders stood in the center, and they placed their hands together in a gesture that meant the same thing in both cultures: a promise, a choice, a new start. Ethan stood nearby, watching. Clara stood beside him, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say. Some moments did not need words. Lyrael came to stand on Ethan's other side. She looked at the ceremony, at the two people standing together for the first time in 2 centuries, and she said one thing. She said that her father had been right. That the adoption had not been a weakness. It had been the bravest thing he had ever done. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked out at the golden sky of Myrith, at the stars that were beginning to appear as the sun went down. Somewhere out there, far across the stars, was Nova Crest. His small apartment, his quiet mornings, his coffee by the window. And somewhere closer, on a dark world with silver-leaved gardens and a star called Solène, was another home, one he had not chosen, but one that had chosen him. He carried both of them now. Both worlds lived inside him, and he was the bridge between them. Not because he was special, not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the bravest man alive, but because he had been willing to stand in the space between and to stay there even when it was hard. The war that had lasted 200 years did not end with a battle. It did not end with a weapon or a victory or a defeat. It ended with a quiet man from a quiet colony, standing in an open field and asking 2 great peoples to try something they had never tried before. It ended with peace. And as the last light of the sun disappeared below the horizon of Myrith, Ethan Cole looked up at the stars, all of them stretching out forever in every direction. And for the first time since he had left Nova Crest, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be,